polio outbreak and the man in iron lung, Paul Alexander. Paul Alexander was one of the few people to survive the polio epidemic that struck America in the 1950s. For 7 decades of his life, he relied on a breathing machine called the iron lung. Polio left him paralyzed from the neck down. Children who contracted polio during the period before the vaccine was discovered either died or they lived a life of disability relying on braces, wheelchairs, crutches, or iron lungs. Alexander was the last iron lung user, before a British iron lung user died in December 2017 at the age of 75. The iron lung replaced the role of his diaphragm, helping him to keep breathing. How did Alexander live his life, and how dangerous is the polio pandemic? We will talk about it further, but don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe to this channel. Polio is actually an ancient disease that has been discovered since the time of ancient Egypt. A famous tale depicts a priest suffering from a typical paralysis, which is a decay of the lower part of his right leg and the sole of his foot. This tale is known to have originated from the 18th dynasty of ancient Egypt, around 1570 to 1342 BCE. In addition, the mumia of Pharaoh Siptah from the late 19th dynasty, 1342 to 1197 BCE, shows similar changes to his left foot and sole. After that, polio never spread seriously, at least until the 18th century. During the time before the invention of the vaccine, polio was considered a dangerous disease that mostly affected children. People avoided public gatherings or crowds. Bars, swimming pools, movie theaters, and other crowded places were closed. Some parents were more protective. They had to know who their children were playing with. They don't even allow their children to make new friends. Every time after playing, they checked on their children to see if they were showing symptoms of polio. The first clinical description of polio was made by a British doctor, Michael Underwood, in 1789. He described the paralytic disease experienced by a baby in a medical textbook. In 1840, it was recognized by a German doctor, Jakob Henne. In the early 19th century, cases of polio were reported several times in the medical literature, but were only considered as ordinary sporadic cases. In New York, the largest polio outbreak occurred in 1916, killing over 2,000 people. While in the United States, the worst polio outbreak occurred in 1952, killing more than 3,000 people. One of the victims was 6-year-old Paul Alexander. Alexander's life changed in the middle of a hot July in Texas. That afternoon, he was playing with his brother in the summer rain. Texas weather at the time reached over 100 Fahrenheit or 38 centigrade. Alexander saw the city streets splashed with DDT insecticide, even though officials knew mosquitoes were not the cause of the polio outbreak. Alexander returned home when he didn't feel well. His neck hurt and his head ached with a throbbing pain. His mother came to him surprised and worried. He had a fever. Alexander was told by his mother to rest. On his first day of illness, he spent time coloring Roy Rogers' books. His whole body started to ache and his fever got worse. The private doctor attending had predicted that Alexander had polio but advised him to recover at home. Furthermore, the hospital was already overwhelmed with other polio patients. 5 days later, Alexander's condition had not improved. He could not walk, hold his crayons, talk, swallow, or cough. Finally, his parents decided to take him to Parkland Hospital. He was examined by a doctor, but there was nothing else he could do. Alexander was left on a stretcher in the hallway of the hospital, barely breathing. It wasn't long before another doctor saw there was hope. He took Alexander to the operating room and performed an emergency tracheotomy. Alexander woke up 3 days later, his little body inside a device that would continue to keep him company. He couldn't speak, nor move. His vision was limited. The roar of the machine was all he could hear. Sometimes he had to lie in his own feces for hours because he couldn't ask the staff for help. The 18 months after he regained consciousness were like torture for Alexander. The room he was in was mostly filled with children his own age. They were also in the same machine as him. Almost every day he heard their cries of pain. When he got bored, he tried to communicate with the other children using facial expressions. But their friendship never lasted long. Not many of them could survive like Alexander. The doctors forced him to breathe without an iron lung. Sometimes it made his body turn blue and faint. They also taught him the glossopharyngeal breathing technique, which is actually almost like breathing, where the air is inhaled through the mouth and then swallowed. In 1953, when Alexander was allowed to return home, the first polio vaccine was discovered by Jonas Salk, a doctor working at the University of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The vaccine was tested on himself and his family. Later, it was tested more widely in 1954 to 1955, led by Thomas Francis, Jr., a professor from the University of Michigan. Hence, this trial is known as the Francis Field Trial. It involved 1.8 million children from first, second, and third grades across the United States. The results were announced on April 12, 1955, called the Inactivated Poliovirus Vaccine, or IPV. It was immediately distributed to clinics, and production was licensed to 6 pharmaceutical companies at once. On April 13, 1955, the Mayo Clinic was the first clinic to receive this vaccine. Although vaccine development would improve in the future, the polio virus had already paralyzed Alexander's nerves. That Christmas Eve in 1953, his parents hired a truck and portable generator to take him home with his iron lung. Any minute it looked like that old generator would go off, his father Gus told a Texas newspaper. Alexander went home because the hospital didn't believe he would survive much longer. The hospital's assumption was wrong. Alexander gained weight. His brother cooked him the best plate of bacon he had ever eaten. His parents always made sure his irons were on, but at that time, Texas had frequent power outages due to storms or tornadoes, so his parents had to pump the machine manually with the help of other neighbors. When Alexander was 8 years old, his mother received a call from a physiotherapist working with the March of Dimes, an American charity dedicated to eradicating polio. At first, Alexander strongly rejected the goodwill, as he was still scared of the doctors and nurses. However, his mother continued to persuade and convince him until he yielded. Mrs. Sullivan, a therapist, came to help him twice a week. Sullivan taught Alexander to breathe using the frog breathing technique, where he learned to hold air in his throat cavity and force his muscles to lower the air past his vocal cords and into his lungs. To boost Alexander's motivation, Sullivan promised to buy him a puppy if he could hold his breath for 3 minutes. Although it took Alexander a year to fulfill Sullivan's task, he didn't stop practicing there. His puppy, named Ginger, made him want to stay out of the irons even longer. At first, he was able to get out of his iron lung to the veranda of his house, then to the yard. He was breathing more and more reliably, so he left the iron lung for much longer. In the afternoons, his friends often took him for walks around the neighborhood in his wheelchair. As long as the school does not allow home learning, Alexander learns the basics of reading with his mother. His father also made him a pen with a stick, which Alexander could bite to write and paint with. When Dallas High School allowed him to take part in non-physical learning, Alexander managed to catch up and graduated at the age of 21. His friends started taking him to the movies, bars, and restaurants. Alexander applied to Southern Methodist University, but the university rejected him several times. Alexander did not give up. They finally approved his application on 2 conditions. Alexander had to get the latest polio vaccine and find a caretaker to help him attend classes. He earned his law degree in 1978 and then a graduate degree in 1984 from the University of Texas. During his undergraduate studies, he fell in love with a girl named Claire. They got engaged. However, Claire's mother interfered with their relationship and forbade Claire from continuing to communicate with Alexander. It was a tough time that took a long time to heal. After his love story fell apart, Alexander decided to live in a dormitory while finishing his studies at the University of Texas. However, the caretaker he hired didn't come for a month. While Paul searched for a new caretaker, his friends in the dorm took care of him. Alexander found work as a lecturer in legal terminology to course stenographers at a trade school in Austin. May 19, 1986, he passed the bar exam. He raised his right thumb when he took the oath to act with integrity as a lawyer before the Chief Justice of the Texas Supreme Court. In her 40s, he spent more time outside of iron lung, especially when he started working as a lawyer around Dallas and Fort Worth. Many of his clients who walked into his office were confused by his iron lung. They didn't even know what polio was. Given that polio had been successfully eradicated in the 1970s in the United States, the second vaccine, called the oral poliovirus vaccine, or OPV, was discovered by Albert Sabin at the University of Cincinnati, Ohio in 1961 to 1963. OPV uses the virus in a weakened form. It can be given in drops, orally, or with sugar. This one vaccine is much easier to give to children, not giving a scary impression. However, at that time, the interest was too low. Sabin has only tested the vaccine on himself and his family. There have been no large-scale trials. Before the Second World War broke out, Sabin worked with a team of Russian virologists in 1956. They traveled to Moscow and Leningrad. Later, Sabin worked for a long time with Mikhail P. Chumakov. With him, Sabin's vaccine was tested on a large scale in the Soviet Union in 1958, involving 20,000 children, and 1959 involving 10 million children. In Czechoslovakia, 110,000 children were vaccinated from 1958 to 1959 in an effective and safe manner. By the time he reached 70, Alexander was already struggling to breathe without his lung iron. Despite this, he managed to surpass the age of his parents and siblings. He spent his time writing a memoir entitled 3 Minutes for a Dog, My Life in an Iron Lung, a title suggested by his caretaker Kathy Gaines. Kathy had been Alexander's caretaker since he graduated from law school, where due to his diabetes he was blind and unable to pursue a career in law. It took Alexander more than 8 years to write the memoir. Sometimes he wrote it himself with a pen or typed it on a keyboard. Sometimes he dictated it to his former caretaker, Norman Brown. In 2015, his iron lung began to fail and his air leaked. A friend shared a video of Alexander asking for help on YouTube. The video reached a local engineer in Dallas who was glad to help and fix it. He also started actively sharing his story on TikTok around January. As Alexander grew older, his body became weaker. He often went back and forth to the hospital. The last time he was hospitalized for a long time, his condition did not improve. He finally died a few weeks later on March 11, 2024, at the age of 78.